Good morning, Walnut Village. Today we are in our Bible study, Joshua 5. But it was 2 weeks ago that we last were together electronically in Joshua 4. So let us come back kind of thinking where we left off and get some context before we enter into Joshua 5 today. As you recall from Joshua 4, Israel had crossed over to the other side of the Jordan River, to the Promised Land. We had seen the miracle of the large swath of land where the water was banked up so that the Israelites could cross. And the Israelites knew in this moment, and particularly from the word from the spies that had been sent out about the land that they were going to enter, that they had to trust God for everything they had. They knew the challenges were going to get bigger, but they also knew so would the blessings. Now God continues to speak to Joshua, and Joshua takes direction from God. Joshua listens, Joshua hears, Joshua obeys, and then Joshua directs the children of Israel. Joshua chooses 12 men to select stones and build a memorial of the coming crossing event so that the current and future generations would remember and their faith would increase. God takes time out from what is ahead, the conquering of the land, getting settling in the land. He takes time out with Israel because he needs to conquer them spiritually before they can conquer Jericho under God's guidance. Now, the purpose of this memorial was so that the people of Israel would teach their children about the great things that God had done, so that the work of God would not be forgotten among future generations. We often fail in our trust of God because we forget the great things he has done. And often the faith of our children is weak because they have not consistently been reminded how great God is and how real his workings are in our lives. I often say, if you want to know how the future is going to be with God, just look at your past with God, and that should give you confidence and faith. And that's exactly what these memorial stones were all about for the children of Israel and their children. So God established Joshua as a leader so that when Joshua gave a God-given directive, it was followed without hesitation. I mean, think of those priests. The priests are told to go into the water, and it was a raging torrent, and they don't hesitate. They go in, and then dry land is established. So the priests follow Joshua's command. The river wells up, exposing a very wide swath of not mucky, muddy, squishy land, but dry land upon which Israel, the thousands and thousands and thousands of Israelites, their men, women, children, their animals piled high with belongings, they're able to cross in a relatively short period of time because the swath of land is so wide. Now, once the people had crossed the river, it returned to its natural flow. The manner and the timing with which the Jordan returned to its natural flow shows that this event was supernaturally arranged by God. It wasn't a fluke. God encourages Israel with another display of his power and dominion over nature. But now, like children, we all need reminders of lessons learned. And here God reminds Israel of the Red Sea miracle, something from their past, of his provision for them continuously, past, present, and future. And in fact, we see in the future, in the very, very far future, that Jesus, when he comes to earth, has the same dominion as God over nature when he performs miracles like walking on water or calming and stopping a deadly storm. Well, it's so easy for us to forget the great miracles God has performed on our behalf. And our lesson from last week reminds us that we must remember the great acts of God as points of faith so that we can trust God for greater and greater works in the future because we have seen and experienced his past faithfulness. Now, God's further purpose, and I love this little phrase that maybe you would overlook. God's further purpose in this miracle and the memorial is not just for the children of Israel, but for the world, so that others would see and know that there is a God in heaven who can work miracles, a God they should seek with all their heart. So God has a plan for his children, the children of Israel. He has a plan for expanding that family to all that would believe in Jesus Christ. And so we all become the new Israel. We all become children of God. And he has a plan for the world at large, a world that he loves dearly and wants to save. And so this God in heaven does miracles so that the world could see this. That brings us to our passage for today, Joshua 5, verses 1 through 15. When all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings who lived along the Mediterranean coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan River so that the people of Israel could cross, they lost heart and were paralyzed with fear because of this. Now just think about this. Obviously, this miracle was witnessed, was seen, was understood by the inhabitants of the land. Because that swath of dry land was so large, we can know and we can imagine that a lot of people witnessed what was going on with the children of Israel. And because of this, they were paralyzed with fear. Not because of the Israelites themselves. They were a small people, a small community, really, even though we talk about thousands upon thousands. And they weren't warlike like the Amorites were. But when our spiritual enemies see that we are trusting in God and are willing to step out in obedient faith, even when it seems crazy, like the upcoming Jericho that we're going to learn about, they lose confidence in their battle against us. Just as the Amorite kings and all those along the coast of the Mediterranean heard, were worried, were scared, not of the Israelites, but of the God that they worshiped that was on their side protecting them. Now we may forget, but our spiritual enemies always remember that if God is for us, who can be against us? And that's from Romans 8:31. They know, our spiritual enemies know that when we are really trusting in God, their defeat is assured. And that goes for Satan and his minions as well. Remember, Paul says we're fighting not just against flesh and blood, but against principalities. That's spirits of the evil world. All right, so now we're going to come upon a strange passage. Israel reestablishes its covenant ceremonies. Verse 2. At that time, the Lord told Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the second generation of Israel. Oh man, if I was listening to God, obedient to God, and I heard I had to take stone knives and perform this kind of surgery on all the men in my family and the larger family and in the country, yuck, I'm sorry. Verse 3, forgive me here. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the entire male population of Israel at Gilbeth-Harloth. Well, apparently all during the 40 years of waiting in the wilderness, none of the sons born during that time had been circumcised. Now, we don't know from the passage or the text why no circumcisions took place, but certainly this was a wholesale neglecting of the act which they were commanded to do, which God started with Abraham, which was to demonstrate physically their commitment to God with this sign, this circumcision. And so now God is reminding them of this covenant, and he has commanded that this be done. So Joshua gets this commandment. Verse 4, and as he always is, Joshua, no matter what he thought, is obedient. It says, verse 4, Joshua had to circumcise them because all the men who were old enough to fight in battle when they left Egypt had died in the wilderness. Those who left Egypt had all been circumcised, but none of those born after the Exodus, during the years in the wilderness, the 40 years, none of them had been circumcised. The Israelites had traveled in the wilderness for 40 years until all the men who were old enough to fight in battle when they left Egypt had died. For they had disobeyed the Lord, and the Lord vowed that he would not let them enter the land that he had sworn to give them, a land flowing with milk and honey. So what we see here is that all those people punished for their disobedience perished in the desert, but their children would be allowed to enter the promised land. But before they can come in, God wants to reestablish the covenant with them through this ceremony of circumcision. So Joshua makes clear the reason why there had to be a new generation born in the wilderness. Joshua makes it clear it was because the old generation had not obeyed the voice of the Lord. And they had not and could not then take and enjoy the promise of a land flowing with milk and honey by faith. So verse 7, so Joshua circumcised their sons, those who had grown up to take their father's places, for they had not been circumcised on the way to the promised land. This is such an odd thing, at least to modern individuals. Circumcision was always a powerful act of consecration to God. And in it, an Israelite said, I'm not like the other nations. I listen to God and do what he says I should do. It was stepping out in faith, obedience, and identifying yourself as one of the Lord's people. This is what the Israelites were doing. It was the renouncing the flesh and the world. It was dying to self and living to God. Now, in the Torah, we read that God commands Abraham, the patriarch, the founder of the Israelites and Israel, to circumcise himself at age 99. God also specifies that all generations afterward, male descendants, must observe this practice, which God calls the mark of the covenant between me and you. However, the Torah doesn't indicate, I'm really stumbling with this, forgive me. The Torah just never indicates why circumcision is what marks this very important covenant. There is a trend among Jewish thinkers to not advance specific explanations for the commandments and instead accept that all the commandments contribute to a goal of submitting to God's will. This is so wise. We don't need to try to fill in the reasons. We don't need to try to fill in the specifics of why circumcision, why it had to happen again, what's the big deal about it. All we have to do is accept that it's a commandment for us in our submitting to God's will. So Jewish authorities who accept this line of thinking have argued that the foreskin has no purpose except its removal, an act that symbolizes Jews' willingness to totally obey God. This, they believe, is a reason enough to do it. So we don't need to question God. We don't need to try to figure it out. It's just like the old hymn says, trust and obey. All right, verse 8. So after all the males had been circumcised, they rested in the camp until they were healed. I would hope so. So not only did Israel cross over the Jordan at a militarily undesirable place, that is, it was right in front of Jericho, the strongest military outpost of the Canaanites, just in full view, that's where they decided to cross. They also incapacitated their army for several days by the circumcision surgery. The soldiers had to rest up and recover. They did this because they trusted God and his directions. Instead of their own wisdom, they listened to God. They followed and obeyed him, as crazy as it may have seemed. You can imagine there were voices that were in dissent, that were disagreeing, that were saying, that's not a good strategy, Joshua. And Joshua calmly and fervently, strongly would answer them, saying, we need to trust God. So they did this because they trusted God and his directions instead of their own wisdom. They were put in a place where they could trust in nothing but God alone. And some of you have at times in your lives been placed in a spot where only thing that you could do was to trust God. It's a hard place, but it's a good place. All right, verse 9. Then the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the shame of your slavery in Egypt, so that place has been called Gilgal to this day. So what's going on here? Well, God called Israel to a place where they saw themselves as they were in him, in faith. By faith, they could see themselves as an obedient, trusting people, and they could stop seeing themselves as they had felt and been when they were in slavery and bondage. I don't know if any of you have suffered under a tyrannical boss or been in a situation where someone was almost treating you as a slave, but there's a mentality there, a downtrodden mentality, a difficult position to be in. And God was rescuing the children from this place, the children of Israel from this place of shame. And so we pick the story up then at verse 10. While the Israelites were camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, they celebrated Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the first month. Okay, so we're picking up the remembrance of Egypt. We're seeing, of course, that it's the same work that God wants to do in us, taking away the dishonor and shame of our previous sin and rebellion, so that we may see ourselves as who we are in Jesus, forgiven, victorious, and blessed as we walk in obedience to Him, faithful to the great plan He has for us. But then there is the celebration of Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the first month. Now, the original Passover, of course, could never be repeated. And as you recall, this was when the angel of death passed over the houses of Israel, that's the name, Passover, and spared their children while killing the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. So the Passover could never be repeated, but there was power in remembering it. So they were to always live remembering that they were people delivered by God. They were to remember God's work of deliverance among them. After the Passover, this is the way we need to live. In the same way, we are to be in a constant remembrance of our redemption at Calvary and live our lives in the shadow of the cross. All right, verse 11. The very next day they began to eat unleavened bread and roasted grain harvested from the land. No manna appeared on the day that they first ate from the crops of the land, and it was never seen again. So from that time on, the Israelites ate from the crops of Canaan. So that strange bread from heaven, that manna that God provided for them in their desert as part of their provision, it stopped. It was never seen again. And they began to accept what God gave them in terms of the rich land flowing with milk and honey, available crops. So the Israelites had to trust God to bring manna every day while in the desert, and they were forced to be dependent on God after all the time that they spent in the desert. But here they are now in Canaan, and they also have to trust Him again to provide for them through other means, such as crops that the rich land would provide when they settled. In other words, they needed to learn the lesson of dependence on God in lean times and in times of plenty, a lesson we need to learn as well. All right, so now we come to an interesting few verses in our chapter. The Lord's commander confronts Joshua. So as we will see, there's a lot packed into these last 3 verses of chapter 5. Questions arise for us. Who is the strange man? Why is he appearing to Joshua? Why does Joshua bow before him? And what lesson is there here for us? Let's pick that up at verse 13. When Joshua was near the town of Jericho, he looked up and he saw a man standing in front of him with a sword in hand. Joshua went up to him and demanded, "Are you friend or foe?" So there must have been something really powerful in this man that was before him. And Joshua does the right thing. He needs to protect his people. He's the shepherd over God's people. And he has a responsibility to see if this man, this being, this person that presents himself with such power is a friend or is an enemy. Well, the answer he gets we find in verse 14. The man says, "Neither one." Now, this was a logical question to this impressive man. Who are you, friend or foe? The response of the man, though, was really curious, almost an elusive no. No was not a proper answer for Joshua's question. Joshua didn't learn anything. In a sense, the man refuses to answer Joshua's question because it is not the right question. And it is not the most important question to be asked at the time. The question really wasn't if the Lord was on Joshua's side. The proper question was if Joshua was on the Lord's side. Friend or foe Didn't matter whose side was Joshua on. Then if it was a friend or foe, Joshua was safe, the children of Israel were safe, because it didn't matter if God was on their side. Well, the man answers then further, I am the commander of the Lord's army. Now we know that this being standing before Joshua was God. Now why do we know that? Well, let's look at this a little closer. Though the title commander of the army of the Lord maybe could apply to an angel, such as Michael, when we read about him in Revelation chapter 12. But Joshua's falling down and worshiping is the key. That is an inconsistent action with angels. You don't worship the angels. Remember the 10 Commandments, thou shalt have no other gods before me. It is only God that you would bow down to. And angels never receive worship. Only God receives worship. And we find that in Revelation 22, verse 8. So the army of the Lord here is used in a way that implies that the armies, plural, armies commanded are angelic armies. And this is a being who commands angels. And we know that God commands angel armies. But again, here is the key. As I mentioned before, at this, Joshua fell with his face to the ground in reverence. I am at your command, Joshua said. What do you want your servant to do? And the commander of the Lord's armies replied, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy. So here we get confirmation that it is God. We pick up from the story of Moses and the burning bush and the fact that that was God. Joshua refers to the angel as my Lord, another indication that this is God. But most of all, the command to remove his sandals. This is a picture of humanity and contact with the dirty world. God cannot be in an unholy place and in contact with sin because he is holy. So the command, remove your sandals, was to Joshua, and we read this and knew this from Exodus 3, that's the story of the burning bush, a clear proof that the man standing before him was the voice from the burning bush, none other than God himself, Yahweh. So we read again in 15, and Joshua did as he was told. Now why did God, and this is a question, a reasonable question to ask, why did God come to Israel at this strategic time? He had come to instruct Joshua in the plan to capture Jericho. This is necessary. As we read about Jericho, and as we will see, it is such a crazy plan. The marching, the being quiet for 7 days, then the shouting, and then the walls come tumbling down, really. For Joshua, for the children of Israel, it was important, and God knew their weakness. God knew that they would need a presence. And so he had come to Joshua to instruct him in the plan to capture Jericho. Joshua is going to carry out a plan in the following chapter that we will see that is so improbable, it could only have been initiated at the direct command of God. Most of all, God had come to conquer Israel. And what do I mean by that? Well, before Israel could conquer anything else in the promised land, they had to be conquered by God. Likewise, we have to be conquered by God. Joshua's total submission, what would you have me do? What do you want your servant to do? His total submission shows that Israel, who Joshua leads, is conquered, ready to submit to God. This is the missing element in the life of victory for many Christians. They have not been and are not continually being conquered by God. Well, something further then as we wrap up to consider. I talked a lot about this odd thing of circumcision. Well, the idea of circumcision of the heart is found in Romans 2:29, and it refers to having a pure heart dedicated to God. Paul is discussing the role of the Old Testament law as it relates to Christianity. He argues the Jewish circumcision, is only an outward sign of being set apart for God. However, if the heart is sinful, then the physical circumcision is of no avail. It's not important. It's meaningless. A circumcised body and a sinful heart are at odds with each other. Rather than focus on external rites, Paul focuses and tells us to focus on the condition of the heart. Using circumcision as a metaphor, he says that only the Holy Spirit can purify a heart and set us apart to God. So ultimately, circumcision cannot make a person right with God. The law is not enough. Following the law, following this physical act, not enough. A person's heart must change. And Paul calls this change circumcision of the heart. Well, as we turn to our prayer for this week, let me remind you that in Luke 18, Jesus teaches the parable of the persistent widow. He says, and we read, "Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up." So I'm asking you to continue to pray for these things that we have been praying for, and we need to continue praying for, just as the parable teaches us, not to give up. Give thanks for the vaccine and the staff who provide our care. Ask God to bless our new president, to keep him healthy, and that he will seek God's wisdom in all the deliberations and actions required of him. Ask God to heal our nation and to unify us in the pursuit of those things that will bless many people. Ask God to fuel you with wisdom and hope as you read his word. Ask God to bring protection for your family and friends. Okay, that's our lesson for today. I will see you in Joshua next week. But I'll just remind you that tomorrow on Wednesday, the 17th, there will be a brief service for Ash Wednesday. And I will be talking about ashes on the heart.